Have anybody seen like a good suspenseful movie, read a good suspenseful book lately? Any examples of that? Any at all? The Batman, that's a good one. That works. Well, we recently, Cassie and I and my family, went to see Harry Potter Deathly Hallows Part 2 with the live orchestra. It was really cool, but I was struck at the end, like how actually suspenseful it feels when you get to the end of an 8th movie and all of a sudden Hagrid comes out carrying Harry in his arms. And it's like all these characters that have been part of 8 movies, 7 books, like it was all for nothing. They fought the war for nothing. They were in school. Like it's over. And you're wondering in that moment, like, is this the end? Like, what was the point? Is this where it all comes to an end? And if you know the movie, as Harry rolls out of Hagrid's arms and the fight continues, that's not how it ends. But in that moment, you're almost, if you've never, like, if that's your first time watching the movies and you've never read the books, you're like, whoa, like, this is how the story ends. Such an anticlimactic yet suspenseful ending. And we see that all throughout the Old Testament. And I think we miss that in the Old Testament, the suspense of the Old Testament. In Genesis 3:15, God, after Adam and Eve have sinned, tells Eve that you will have offspring that will crush the head of the serpent. And so there's this promise for offspring, and yet, like 2 chapters later, there's a flood that is coming to wipe out the whole world. Like, is God's promise already going to fail? Is it going to come short? He then promises Abraham descendants as numerous as the stars. And not 2 chapters later, Isaac is on an altar after so long of not having a child, though one child lays on an altar. Is this the end? And all throughout the Old Testament, we see this. You have the people go into slavery into Egypt, and their populations start to fall, and they're subjugated under this. You have the northern kingdom go and they're conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. And so it's like, okay, you have the southern kingdom left, but all of a sudden 100 years later, they're in exile in Babylon. And all throughout the Old Testament, you have this suspense of like, is this where the promises of God fail? Is this where God's promises to Abraham, David, to Eve, like, is this where they fall apart? Is this where they fall short of what he promised them? And Esther is another example of that. Esther is another story of God's people in exile and God's people coming under threat and the very safety, not just of God's people, but of God's promises at risk. But today we're going to see, as we kind of become to the beginning of this conclusion of the book of Esther, that all throughout the Old Testament, just as it has happened, it happens again in Esther, that our main idea today is that God is faithful to his promises and to his people. God always remains faithful to his promises and to his people. He is a faithful God, and as we are going to see today, he once again delivers his people out of the suspense and out of the harm that is to come to them because he is faithful. And so turn with me, if you're not already there, to Esther 8:15. We'll be last 3 verses of chapter 8, and we'll be going a little bit into 9. Esther 8:15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edicts reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. I think this line here, 3 short words in verse 1 really sum up what happens here really well. The reverse occurred. If you look back at this end of chapter 8, if you remember a few chapters ago, it was Haman that wanted to be in charge. Haman thought he was the second best in the kingdom. It was his. He was going to be the guy. And now you see Mordecai come out. Mordecai in royal robes of blue and white, with a crown and robe of fine linen and purple, and the people shouting and rejoicing. That was supposed to be Haman. That's what Haman thought he was going to do, that he was going to be. And instead you have Mordecai, a man who would have been relatively unknown in that area up until now, is the savior of God's people in this instance, being celebrated as such. And then if you look with me at verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. I think those 4 adjectives are intentional. If you've been here, you'll remember that when the edict was first given by Haman that these things should happen to the Jews, that was not the Jews' original response. They were not light, they weren't joyful, they weren't glad, and they definitely had no honor. And so we're going to see how the reverse occurred in here. And so chapter 3, verse 15 says that as the people went out and spread this new edict of the king, confusion was all about the city. The city was thrown into confusion. You had this burden of chaos, of confusion, as they wondered what was to come. But now, as they recognize God's sovereignty, as they see his hand at work, and as they have now been given the chance to defend themselves against this edict, we see that they have light, that burden of chaos and confusion has since passed, and they now feel light because they know that their God is in control. And when we remember that our God is in control, how could we have where is the confusion and chaos? I'm always reminded in the Psalms, whom shall I fear? When I remember that my God is in control, truly whom shall I fear? And that's what the Jews were feeling in this moment. And then we move to light, or to gladness and joy. When it says the city was thrown into confusion, and then chapter 4 starts, and it says that, and in every province, in verse 3, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. That doesn't sound like gladness and joy. They were fasting, they were weeping, lamenting, mourning. They knew what this meant. They were powerless to stop this. They had no ability to go against what the king had declared. They had no power to stop this. But as they see God's hand again, in Esther interceding on their behalf, and Mordecai, and just the fact that they now have, in the face of what should have been impossible for them, is now possible. What once was mourning and weeping and lamenting is gladness and joy. Not because of anything they did, they couldn't have, but because of what God has done to bring them to this place. And lastly, we see honor. Right after that, in chapter 4, it says that Esther is distressed and she tries to send clothes to Mordecai because he has no honor. He is laying at the city gate, unable to even go in, covered in sackcloth and ash. That was part of the ritual of weeping and lamenting and mourning. But with the sackcloth and ash, he had no honor. There was no honor among the people. They were to be gotten rid of purely because they could. And yet here, again, we see the reverse occurred. There is now honor among God's people because God himself has again been faithful to them as his people. And that's honor. That's where we get our honor from. Not because of we're special or we earned what we had or we deserved salvation in a sense, but because God has chosen us to be his people and is faithful to us as his people. That is our source of honor. And so we see all throughout that the reverse occurred. What Haman wanted was to destroy the Jews, to eradicate them. God, though, had a different plan. It was a clash of wills, and I think we all know, kind of in some sense, we can all relate to that. There are some things I desperately want, and I know deep down that God does not want those. And somehow, some way, I haven't quite figured it out yet, he always wins. I'm trying my best to figure out how to change that, but his will always comes out on top. And we see that again here. Haman wanted to kill the Jews. He was jealous, he was angry, he was bitter, and this was continuing like a 100+ year war, centuries-year war with the Amalekites that Haman thought he would be the one to finish. He would be the one to finally drive the stake home and end the Jews, and God had different plans. And so we see at the end of verse 4, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. And so Mordecai has this power, but we come to an interesting point in the story. Because I've mentioned it a couple times, but the Jews aren't just freed from the king's edict. The king has given this edict that they can go out on this specific day and kill the Jews. The problem was, he can't just go, nope, didn't mean that. He has to release a different edict in competition with that. And if you'll remember, it's somewhere here in chapter 8, that in verse 11, his edict says that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them. On the day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So the Jews aren't just freed. There's light, there's honor, there's joy, there's gladness. But it's an edict of defense. And so we reach this conflict point. Here's where we reach our ultimate suspense, is the day comes. It says in verse 1, now in the 12th month, the day that the king's edict was to be carried out. Here we come again to the same question we faced all throughout the Old Testament. Is this where God's people meet their end? Is this it? Is this where God's promises finally fail? It's almost like they're celebrating with joy and gladness and honor and light, but it's not over yet. Are they the team that hits the layup with a second left and starts celebrating and rushing the court, and then the other team throws in a half-court heave, and they ultimately win? Are they celebrating too early? Is this the end? And we're going to see that no, that this is not the end. Because, and I forgot to bring it up, our first point in this whole section is that God is sovereign over the evil plans of man. And that was this section we were just going through. I completely forgot to bring that up. But God is sovereign. He sovereignly reversed all of this. And if God is sovereign over his people, he is also just against those who aren't his people. He has to be. The sovereign God is also righteously just. And so we're going to see that God righteously judges those who oppose him and his people in this second section as we close out chapter 9. Look with me at verse 5. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. That's a big transition point, huh? We come up on this suspense. What's going to happen? There's no more suspense. It's over. The Jews killed and destroyed and did whatever they wanted to because their God was behind them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And also killed, and bear with me here, Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Paratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. Again, we see there is no suspense. God is faithful. He is sovereign, but he is also righteously just against those who oppose him and his people. Back to Genesis 3:15, when God promises offspring to crush the head of the serpent. That ultimately is fulfilled through Christ, who comes and is the offspring that crushes the head of the serpent through the cross, through his death and his resurrection. But that's 500 years later than where we're at now. How is that supposed to happen if there are no people? If there is no line of David left for Jesus to be born through? If there is no Jerusalem to which Jesus is supposed to teach, if there is no Jewish nation over which Rome reigns, through which he is crucified, all the things that had to happen for Jesus to come and do what he did, the sanctity and the safety of the Jewish people, it relies upon that. If God's people fall apart and are no more, then all the promises God has made throughout the Old Testament about what his son would come, how he would come, and what would happen would fail to be. And so this is so important to God's faithfulness and his promises. And we see as they kill the 10 sons of Haman. And I think what that points to is that the seed of the serpent is not just one person. Yes, it's Satan. But the seed of the serpent is so many different family lines and people that the enemy tries to use to get at God's people. And here is Haman and his 10 sons, seeds of the serpent, trying to accomplish what the serpent can't and won't, and they ultimately fail. It is completely eradicated. They stood no chance. And so even though Jesus comes 500 years later, here we see a glimpse of that and what that will look like, that the seed of the serpent has no chance, because the Jews should have had no ability to defend themselves. And yet Haman and his 10 sons, and we're going to see later an overwhelming amount of people that followed them, all fall to the wayside, because God has to righteously judge those who oppose him. And so as we continue in our story, in verse 11, that very day the number of those killed in Susa the citadel was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. In a book that doesn't actually, I don't know if this has been mentioned, but in a book that doesn't ever explicitly mention God, he sure is active, is he not? He sure is moving. He has been so powerful in his defense and faithfulness to his people that the king of Persia lays before a Jewish queen and goes, hey, whatever you want, whatever you want, out of fear, out of respect, a little bit of both, out of just a pure awe, I think, of these people had no right to defend themselves and are going against soldiers and people prepared for this. And they have been overwhelmingly victorious. In just the citadel of the capital alone, 500 people fell. How could he not be afraid? And so he bows before the Jewish queen and says, hey, whatever you want. And I think in that position, especially some of us would be tempted to be like, all right, like my horse is really slow. Like I need a new horse, or like a new chariot, or a cool sword. I would definitely go for the cool sword option. 1,000%. I need a cool sword. And yet Esther doesn't do that. All throughout this story, she was hesitant at first, drives you a little crazy for a minute, because she goes to dinner and is like, just come back. And you're like, no, just talk. And then she comes back and is like, just come back again. And you're like, no, just talk. And so she's a little hesitant in trying to feel the situation out. But again, we see God's sovereignty through that it was the perfect timing of when she talked, that it worked. And so Esther's faithfulness to this and trust in God's plan continues. She doesn't ask for something that benefits her. She asks that God's judgment upon his enemies be continued. Look at what she says in verse 13. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. So she asks that the king would allow the Jews to further continue their judgment upon their enemies on God's behalf, through God's power. And that's just such a beautiful picture that God righteously judges those who oppose him. And if you wondered, all right, maybe Maybe Haman, they named him by name, but maybe Haman's sons weren't dead. Not only did Haman get hanged on a gallows he built, now his 10 sons are hanged as well. It is an ultimate, final, conclusive, decisive end to Haman's evil plans and his family. And where does this go? Do the Jews let this one go by? Absolutely. We're going to see some big numbers here. Verse 15. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So a little less, went from 500 to 300. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So we went from 800 people in 2 days to 75,000 in a day. And whether that's hyperbole, whether that's an actual legit number, I think the point is very clear. Haman's plans were not successful. If he truly sent 75,000 people out to destroy the Jews and they all fell, who else would you turn to and trust in that moment other than God? God's righteous judgment upon his enemies is always complete and perfect. And it reminds me, honestly, of a dumb story about myself. So it was like 7th or 8th grade, and I thought I was going to the NBA. I really did. I thought I was really good. I still thought that in college. I thought I was going to the NBA. And we were playing this game, and the guy's bringing the ball up half court. And I am in a defensive stance like you have never seen one before. I am down. I might have slapped the floor. I'm ready. I'm following him. I'm going for the ball. I'm going over here. I'm running over here. I want the dang ball because I want to steal it and go lay. Actually, I thought I was cooler than that, so I wouldn't have laid it in. I would have just pulled up for 3 and probably airballed it and gone and sat back down on the bench. But I wanted the ball. I was moving, and I was giving it all I had. There was no one trying harder than me, no one that wanted it more than me, no one putting in more effort than me. All my teammates are standing around like this. The other team's standing around like this, and I'm over here just like a madman. The problem was the scoreboard looked a lot like this, and there was about a minute left. And so the other team is like, dude, what are you doing? And my team is like, what are you doing? And the coaches are confused. My parents are confused. The whole crowd is confused. And I'm out there like fouling people. I want the dang ball. And there's a minute left and the score looks like this. And I think it just drives it home so clearly for me the more I thought about this, that this is the scoreboard to an exponential degree of God against our enemy. This is the score the enemy is fighting against all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout the New Testament, and today. I was playing a game I had no chance of winning. I could have stolen the ball 20 times, and we still would have probably lost by 40. I wasn't getting anywhere close. And that is the battle that our enemy fights. He fights a war that he knows he can't win, and then as followers of Christ, we know he can't win. And because he knows he can't win, he is going to do anything and everything he can to try and at least get an extra steal. Get an extra layup. Turn one more person from Christ. Stop one more person from coming to him. Because at least then, he'd only be down by 103 instead of 105. That's what our enemy is facing. And in the book of Esther, we see that so clearly, his desperation. He has failed over and over again. He's failed through his work through the Egyptians, through Assyria, through Babylon. Everything he tries to do fails. And if you remember the story of Joseph, in Genesis 50:20, as his brothers and father come to him, and they're like, hey, we did these terrible things. And Joseph's like, yeah, but what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And Paul says in Romans that he is working all things for the good and glory of those who love him, but also for the glory of his name. Where the Assyrians and the Babylonians came in and tried to exile God's people and are like, look at us, we're powerful. God's like, no, I am using that to bring my people back to myself. No matter what you think you're doing with it. Where the Egyptians thought they were cool because they had all these slaves that could help them, I doubt, build the pyramids. I don't know the timing on that, but it sounds good. They had all these slaves to help them build this. God was using that to show his power through a stuttering man that had no desire to lead his people. And God uses that person to walk through a sea. It just, everything the enemy tries to do comes back to this scoreboard. That it doesn't ultimately matter. It doesn't ultimately end in his victory. He can do nothing that will ever truly succeed. He fights and he fights and he fights. But for those of us who are in Christ, we know that he cannot win. I'm sure we've sung the song 1,000 times that the war's already won. Like the battle's over, but the war's already, like fighting a battle you've already won. I'm getting my songs mixed up. I'm fighting a battle you've already won. But God hasn't just won those individual battles. He's won the war. And I think Esther is such a beautiful, beautiful picture of that. And so as we think about those times on campus or we read the news, there's not a presidential decision. There's not an accident on campus. There's not an evil news story you read. I mean, just turn on the news and you'll see 7. That God's not like, oh, like, didn't know that was happening. Like, how do I turn that to my glory? Like, God is our first point said, sovereign over everything. He's not sometimes sovereign and sometimes not. He's not sometimes just and sometimes not. Because then he'd be sometimes God and sometimes not. And that's a terrifying thought. He's either God or he's not. And if he's sovereign and faithful, and I think Esther is a beautiful story of that, I have full and complete faith that he is God. And he is sovereign and he is faithful to his promises and to his people. And so we have a choice to make, a response. We have a response. Look with me at verse 17. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day a feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. And so the Jews didn't just see this and go, oh, well, once we were over here all shriveled up and powerless, and this whole city and this whole kingdom was going to come after us, and now God has restored us and has delivered us and has been faithful to us. And they're like, well, time to go to class. Like, that's cool. Like, we just witnessed God do a miraculous work, and we're just going to, like, go about our day tomorrow. No, they intentionally set aside time to worship him, to celebrate, and to remember. And that's what we need to do. We need to intentionally set times apart in rhythms of just worshiping God. Worshiping God is not just something we do when the band is up here and we stand for 3 songs and then 1 or 2 at the end. And it's like, okay, well, I'll wait till Wednesday night and then I'll wait again till Sunday morning. We worship God as we recognize his sovereignty in the world. When's the last time you just, as you walked through campus, you went like, how is God moving right now? What is he doing? There's so many people. There's so much happening. Like, it can be so easy to get lost in the whirlwind and the chaos. But how is God moving? What is he doing? And as you begin to see that and you begin to recognize that, maybe it's even just you're walking along. And this is one of my favorite times to walk across campus. If you can get through the 465 traffic jam at the fountain when it's above 55 degrees. Like, my favorite time to walk on campus because it's beautiful. And even just a remembrance of that, you're like, wow, like we serve a sovereign God because no one is creating that. We can't do that. And just as the Jews were powerless to stop everything that was happening, we have a lot less power in our lives, I think, than we recognize. And we have a lot less control than I think we want to admit. I know it in my heart that I have no control, but it's really hard to go, yeah, I'll actually live that out and not fight it and not try to be like, I do I do have control because I'm cool, I'm good, but I don't. We serve a sovereign God, but we also serve a just God. And I think that's the only way to stay sane in this world, is it not? To remember the justice of God. Can we go back to the full reversal screen with everything on it, please? There we go. Thank you. It can be very easy, I think, in the world today, as we see all the news, as we receive, as it talks about the edict of the king going out to the people, to receive the news of the world and go, man, like, I just want to weep and mourn and lament. And I'm sure as heck confused. And it's chaotic, and I don't know what to do. But only when we recognize that our God is both sovereign over everything and is just against those who oppose him can we have light and gladness and joy and honor where none really should exist. Because those who don't follow Christ and have no faith in God, they are just, what hope is there in the world today, right? Like, there is no hope. It is hopeless. It is joyless. It is gladnessless. That's definitely not a word. Lightless, honorless. Like, none of those exist when you don't know God in the midst of the world today. And I think Esther paints a beautiful picture here that though evil exists, it may not always be judged right away by God. Like, Esther's not the blueprint. Like, think of the most evil people you know today, and it's not like, oh, well, they and their 10 sons are going to get hanged before they die. But we can have faith that evil will be judged. And Esther gives us a perfect picture of that. And so as we leave today, I want us to just, two things. One, I've mentioned it, as you walk around on campus, just think to yourself, and God is so faithful when we ask this, and it's been so beautiful. God, how are you moving right now? What are you doing? Like, how are you present and active in the chaos and the hub that is going on right now? And as you begin to see that, worship him. And as you receive news of devastation and evil and just terrible things, yes, there is a healthy sense of grief, but go to him in prayer and remind yourself over and over and over again that God is faithful and that God will judge evil. And so as you go about your week, just remember that God is faithful to his promises and his people. And I think Esther is such a beautiful, perfect reminder of that. And so I'm going to pray for us, and then we will have communion. We will celebrate communion together.